Welcome to No to NATO, No to War. This is our third public meeting. The first two have now been watched by hundreds of thousands of people, making these the biggest anti-war meetings since the great upheaval in 2003 around the invasion and subsequent illegal and murderous occupation of Iraq. That's because this organization is an action organization. It is not consumed by the narcissism of the small difference. As a matter of fact, our speakers all have substantial disagreements with each other on many other things, but have concluded that stopping the world going up in nuclear smoke is much more important than any political differences we might have with each other. There's no in crowd at No to NATO, No to War. There's no permanent roster of speakers. People are not shadow banned and deleted from history, airbrushed. There's no litmus test. And above all, we are bringing interesting new voices onto the battlefield in a way that is capturing people's attention and exciting them about the possibility of rebuilding a mass anti-war movement in the world, and perhaps particularly in the English-speaking world, which is, I'm afraid to say, where most of the problems of the world are originating. Civil war is raging as I speak. Buildings are on fire, cars are on fire, protesters carrying guns and even grenades are on the streets. 40,000 armed police officers have been deployed to baton, to gas, to water cannon, to smoke, and even to shoot unarmed protesters. I refer, of course, not to Russia, but to France. The war is coming home. The proximate reason for the dramatic events unfolding again this evening in France are the gunning down of a 17-year-old boy, an unarmed boy, illicitly, allegedly, driving a motor car in the French city of Nanterre. But of course, that's only the proximate reason. French people have been moving in their millions, sometimes with yellow vests on, sometimes without. Sometimes about pension reform, sometimes about France's role in the world as a leading belligerent in the now existential struggle between the NATO powers and the adversaries NATO has chosen to confront, namely Russia and China, although they have others if you want them. Venezuela may or may not come back onto the enemy roster. Iran has never been off it. Indeed, the scenes that we are witnessing in France this evening are the very scenes that France was encouraging in Iran just a year or so ago. Let's hope that the French President Macron does not suffer the grisly end that the Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, suffered at the hands of, amongst others, France. France and the United Kingdom and the USA destroyed Libya, blew its bloody doors off, to use a Michael Caine-ism. And now 500,000 African men are massing in Libya, desperately looking for a way across the Mediterranean into the European countries who call themselves the Garden and who seek to keep the jungle, in Borrell's words, at bay, but who, having destroyed Libya as a functioning state, have unwittingly, perhaps, opened the doors to that new invasion. All around the southern Mediterranean, countries like Italy, like Spain, and like France are in serious trouble with their economies and with the dysfunctionality of their society. And yet, most of their time they spend obsessing about events in countries far distant from them. Borrell, the European Union's foreign minister, called on all of the EU's navies to sail their ships, not in the Mediterranean, not in the English Channel, not to defend their own coasts, their own lands, but in the Taiwan Straits and in the South China Sea. That, said Borrell, is freedom's frontier. So now we know the European Union satrapies are fully signed up, with one or two exceptions, to the permanent war which has been declared in Washington. In Washington, we now discover that the leader of what they used to laughingly call the free world sleeps in an iron lung. That's right. He sleeps in a machine to enable him to breathe, but not, alas, to think, not, alas, to read an autocue, not, alas, to find his way safely off a stage, not, alas, to stop him falling over repeatedly on public platforms, on stairs to aircraft, and elsewhere. What a state we are in. Some people don't believe in karma. Some people don't believe in any kind of divine justice or retribution. I find it hard to avoid the conclusion that those who set the world on fire, who set out to subjugate, to dominate, and to exploit the others, are now amongst the most dysfunctional societies on the planet. And those that they targeted are, compared to them, at least, a model of functionality, and economically speaking, are outperforming them exponentially. Somebody said the other day, when I put up a video that got 1 million views in less than 48 hours, where are the poor Russians in that video? The perception in Europe that somehow Russia is a poor country is an enduring one. But this year for the first time, the average Russian was better off than the average European. This in the teeth of a level of economic warfare being carried out against Russia by the Western countries, who constitute just 13% of the world's population, has never been more ferocious. They said that they would crush the Russian currency, the ruble. In fact, they crushed their own currencies. Or at least we crushed the pound and the euro. The dollar is not yet crushed, but it exists in its current form and at its current value only because it is used as a reserve currency and the currency for the transaction of oil trades, both of which are now under grave and growing threat. The list of countries seeking to join the BRICS, which was originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is now so large that it tests the very English alphabet to properly describe it. A new acronym from A to Z will very soon be required. Countries that were for decades not just satrapies of the United States and other Western countries have now thrown off the shackle of colonialism, not just run their own flag up in place of the British or the American flag. No, they have literally thrown off the shackles. Countries in Africa, like Niger, like Mali, have ordered France to leave their countries and begun arresting armed Frenchmen found on their soil. Countries like Saudi Arabia, long a byword for a satrapy, have begun to cold shoulder the United States and trade with the enemies of the United States in their own currency and seek to join the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The world is changing fast. The tectonic plates can audibly be heard moving, and the leaders of the Western countries have never been less well placed to meet the challenge. It didn't have to be like this. We could have all warmed under the rising sun in the east of the globe. We could have all traded with each other, invested in each other, cooperated with each other. We could have all been warm. Instead, our leaders have chosen the path of confrontation and war. The war, for the moment, is in the Ukraine and being conducted over the dead bodies of the Ukrainian people. Now, some 300,000 or more dead. 1 in 3 people in Ukraine knows well someone who has died in this conflict, a doubling of the proportion in just 3 months since the last survey was taken. And the average number of people that have died in the conflict that the respondents to the survey knew was 3. And most of those casualties are coming from the west of Ukraine. Something like 65% of the casualties are coming from the bastions of Ukrainian nationalism, and in the Second World War, during the Holocaust, the bastions of Bandera and the other Nazi collaborators who fell upon their own Jewish population and Polish population like wolves, like savage beasts, even before the SS has got there. It couldn't be clearer, I think. This week there was an attack on Kramatorsk. It was originally spun on the BBC and Sky News and elsewhere as an attack on a peaceful restaurant. A peaceful restaurant, it turned out, that contained 2 generals of the Ukrainian armed forces, 15 other senior officers, 50 foreign advisors and mercenaries, and an untold number of other secret services operatives from Western countries, from NATO countries. It was a stunning military success, which unfortunately also killed the young women that had been gathered there as society hostesses for the dinner of the top brass of the Ukrainian military and their NATO allies. The war is going very badly, as anyone with access to any alternative media, whether social media or via VPN, Russian media, which has been banned in the name of freedom in the vast majority of territories in the so-called Western world. Anyone can see that the spring counteroffensive, which became a summer counteroffensive, has fallen, in the words of The Economist and the Wall Street Journal, woefully short of being described as a success. First it was the rains, then it was unexpectedly stiff Russian resistance, then it was mines, then it was the extraordinary fortifications which the Russian armed forces have built over these last few months. The attempted coup d'etat last weekend failed miserably and has now reached the levels of farce. But the Russian people showed in the teeth of that attempted coup d'etat that they are fully behind their country, fully behind their state, fully behind their president. I'm a supporter myself of Mr. Zyuganov, the leader of the political opposition to the Putin government in the Russian Duma. He stepped up to the mark without hesitation and gave his unequivocal support to the president and to the republic and to the armed forces of the Russian Federation. All efforts to destabilize and divide and eventually dismember Russia are doomed to fail, as any perspicacious observer already knows. They depend on a lack of perspicacity on the part of the mass of the people. And that's where we come in. We, all of us, have our own platforms. We are all able to reach people. We have to make available the alternative point of view, the different perspective, even just so that people can say they heard both sides of the argument. But I'm confident that when they hear our side of the argument, that they will side with us. And all the signs are that that is so. As censorship is increased, it is a sign not of strength, but of weakness of the war party. We're the anti-war party. And moreover, we believe that war will always be with us as long as NATO holds the Europeans, the North Americans, and the Australasians and the Japanese in the grip of their hand. We have to break that grip. And all of us are trying to do that with our own arguments in our own way. Even where we disagree on so many other things, we must come together. Or there may not be a world worth arguing over. There may not be a world for any of us to win. So as always, we have assembled an interesting platform that I will now introduce. First of all is a man who has set fire to the internet. You may have seen him on my own shows. You may have watched him, I hope you have, on his own shows. He is never off the screen with a level of analysis, criticism, and an entertaining style that is second to none. For one so young, he's a big star. He's Richard Medhurst, and I call him in now. Richard, where do you see things in the wake of last weekend's events and the subsequent failures this week of the so-called counteroffensive?
Hi, George. Thanks for the kind words, and that was a great opening speech. And well, first of all, when it comes to Prigozhin and this so-called coup or mutiny or whatever people want to call it, I think it was funny watching their so-called analysis on CNN and other mainstream platforms, because they couldn't grasp, they couldn't understand that Prigozhin and Putin coming to a negotiated settlement or a peaceful resolution was a good thing, right? So they interpreted any form of de-escalation or diplomacy as weakness, right? And I'm sure if Putin had wiped out Prigozhin, then they would have called him a butcher. So you can't really win with them. And this idea that Putin lacked the forces to tackle Wagner. I mean, it's preposterous, because on the one hand they're saying that Putin has so many weapons and such an army that he's laying waste to Ukrainian cities, but he can't take on a 25,000 force. And this is if you believe that they were actually going to go to war, with each other. Although Putin did speak about a helicopter being shot down. The Ukrainian states about 12 Russian servicemen killed, but that's besides the point. And when it comes to this counteroffensive, they've been hyping this up for ages, and trying to raise money, siphon off funds away from countries, from that money being invested, instead of being invested in England or in the United States, where they don't even have a healthcare system in the United States, nothing to speak of. They gave all these billions to Ukraine. And then we saw what happened with the Bradleys, which are the American tanks, and the Leopards, the German tanks, a smoking column of twisted metal. That's the counteroffensive. And what did they expect? The Russians have been dug in. The Russians are a professional fighting force. They're not a joke. And they've been constructing trenches, tank ditches, tank traps, mines, and it's horrific. I mean, I think some of you might have seen the videos captured by drones of men trying to get out of minefields. It's something from a horror movie and beyond. So, they're basically taking all of this money that should be spent on healthcare, spent on infrastructure, and giving it to the weapons companies. And they like to frame it as aid to Ukraine, but the only ones that they're aiding are their friends in the arms industry. So, and then the Ukrainian men who have to go off and fight this war, this hopeless war, they're also the ones being sacrificed. They're the pawns that they're sending off. Another thing, this pizzeria or restaurant in Kramatorsk that you mentioned that was attacked in the last 48 hours. There were civilians in there, right? And I think I don't need to remind you of the Troubles, but during the Troubles, it was considered um, a valid target. If you had British soldiers frequenting a bar or a pub or a disco, then that was fair game for the IRA and vice versa, right? So St. Patrick's Day bombing, for example, people killed just for being Catholic, just because they went to this bar. So, the Ukrainian generals, the foreign mercenaries who went to this pizzeria or restaurant in Kramatorsk, they know that the Russians are watching them. They know that they are inviting hell upon the civilians and the local population who are in this bar, who are in this restaurant. And if the situation were reversed, the Ukrainians would have struck them too. And that is, I'm not going to sit here and say, well, that's just war and we should accept it. We shouldn't accept it. This should not be happening. They should not be putting civilians at risk. They know it's going to happen. They know the Russians are targeting them. And I also made the argument that the fact that they're foreign mercenaries is kind of besides the point, because
well, Richard has frozen
turns
there.
into a
We'll bring
target.
him.
It turns into a target for the Russians.
Yeah.
I think Scott Ritter made this point. He's a former intelligence officer in the Marine Corps. He made the point that if two Ukrainian officers are speaking to each other and there's a light bulb, lighting up the room, then that energy grid becomes a target. Now, I don't necessarily agree with most of the rules of engagement that our armies have, but I just wanted to highlight the danger that they're exposing civilians to in the case of Kramatorsk. And then the Kyiv shopping center is another incident or example from last year, where they were parking tanks under the shopping center. And then, of course, there's no media, there's no critical thinking, that they have no brains in the media, so they don't bother asking questions. They just use these tragedies to continue this barrage of nonsense that Russia just likes to kill civilians for the sake of killing civilians because they're evil. And it's such a glaring contradiction, because on the one hand they tell us the Russians are incompetent, the Russians don't have any money for weapons, they've run out of weapons, and then on the other hand they tell us that they have $3 million missiles like the Iskander missile lying around just to waste on restaurants in Kramatorsk. So this is once again a glaring contradiction, the lack of critical thinking in the media is stunning. George, you alluded to the refugees that are in Libya. I would also highlight that the other week you had 750 people who drowned. There was a vessel in the Mediterranean, and the Greek authorities did nothing. They knew what was happening and did absolutely nothing. And I think this is, it's disgusting, right? Because everybody knows, wherever you are in the world, maritime law is that you see somebody drowning, you see somebody in distress, you go and help them, whether you're a destroyer or a tiny yacht or a canoe, you go and help them. And so there's such a lack of humanity, it's astonishing that they spent more attention in the media and money on this Titanic submersible than on helping people who are drowning, civilians who are drowning. And of course, I think all countries who've taken refugees should be They should be thanked. Germany took in a lot of refugees, Canada, and so on. But at the end of the day, they are benefiting. They're benefiting from a new workforce, from young people, from people with diplomas, people who are doctors, engineers, architects, or even as they call it, non-skilled labor. I mean, there's still a new workforce for them, and I I, um, I just find it's it's disgusting what happened to Gaddafi. You alluded to what happened to Gaddafi, and I think we should always remember that these issues, whether it's refugees that are drowning in the Mediterranean, or whether we are talking about the tragedy that has befallen Ukraine, or whether we are talking about North Africa or Syria, all of these things are linked, and we come back to NATO. At the end of the day, we come back to this war machine. Anyone who says that we need NATO to defend Europe, I'm sorry, but this is an obsolete war machine. And when we were in London during the last event, I said if we were in the 1960s, we could have a different conversation, but we're not in the 1960s. And NATO has no purpose since 1991. There is no Soviet Union. Soviet Union is it's completely gone. The Warsaw Pact has been dismantled, and so the West should also understand that it has a duty, as it conveyed to the Russian diplomats, to also step down and dismantle the war machine. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Yugoslavia was the first to really face the horrors of NATO, and then Libya and Syria, and now Ukraine is another victim of NATO. And this is because they want to make money. Zelensky said the other day that he's banning or suspending elections. Now, to his credit, or shall we say, just to give him the benefit of the doubt, yes, the Ukrainian constitution does mandate, or does stipulate rather, that during a time of martial law, you cannot have elections. Fine. But he is the one who renews the martial law. So he could decide on August 18th when it expires, because it has a 90-day period. He could decide not to renew it and have elections. Syria had elections, and Syria is in a far worse state than
Had
Ukraine
two
is.
elections.
Exactly right. So what's his excuse? If he's so confident of his mandate, then there should be no problem. Obviously, again, to give him the benefit of the doubt, I understand it's not an ideal situation, but why is he banning Russian books? This is just last week, Russian books and Belarusian books. Why did he ban all the other parties? I think it might be hard to have elections when you've banned all the other parties.
Yes.
And then banning religious groups linked to Russia. So is this the democratic champion that NATO and the EU have put forward? If yes, I think we're in a very sorry state.
Whatever Russia has on its plate in Ukraine, it hasn't stopped them from assisting the Syrian people and their government in rooting out the last bastions of ISIS and Al Qaeda in Idlib. Tell us what's been happening over the last few days there, if you will.
Right. So the Russians they're still conducting strikes, and as you mentioned, the Idlib is really this this Al Qaeda stronghold, and it's funny because every time the Americans claim to have killed an ISIS leader, lo and behold, where did this take place? In Idlib, right? So this is right on. It's basically on the border with Turkey, right? So I mean, or I should say, Turkey has made it. They've annexed it, all but annexed it. That people use Turkish currency there now, and Turkey supports either directly or by turning a blind eye. They support Al Qaeda. So now they've rebranded. They call themselves HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There are other groups like the so-called Syrian National Army. Just to be very clear, this is not the Syrian. The official armed forces of Syria, which are called the Syrian Arab Army. The SNA is a Turkish-backed militia or rebel group. But again, calling them rebels is kind of funny because you don't even know where most of these people come from. I mean, you've got 5,000 Uyghurs in northern Syria, in this region in Idlib. You've got, as I mentioned, the Turkish armed forces, the Turkish-backed groups. And so this is a very precarious situation because Turkey is a NATO state, right? So we should keep that in mind, that NATO is occupying, through Turkey, is occupying a large chunk of Syria. Then we have the United States in, west, east of the Euphrates River, occupying all the oil fields, occupying the crops, because this is known as the breadbasket region. And so they do that in partnership with the Kurdish militias. And then, of course, when it comes to the Russians, if it weren't for Russia, I think Al Qaeda would have almost certainly taken control of Syria. I mean, they were really already in the capital, in Jobar, and so on. And when the Russians came in, I know Patrick mentioned Soleimani earlier. There's this famous meeting that Nasrallah spoke of, that Soleimani went to Moscow to meet with Putin, and he convinced him in 2 hours to go and help in Syria, because Syria had asked Russia multiple times and they always refused. They didn't want to get mixed up in it, but he made them understand that this whole region is going to collapse entirely if they don't help. And it's only because of Hezbollah, because of Iran, and because of the Syrian army and the Russian army that Syria did not fall under fall into the shadow of ISIS. The thing is, though, that it's still carved up into 4 parts. You've got Israel, that have been occupying the Golan Heights since *67. As I mentioned, now you've got Turkey in the north, America to the east, the United States to the east, and Russia is the only one that seems to be interested in fighting Al Qaeda and fighting these extremists, these foreign extremists or foreign-backed extremists, take your pick, that have come into Syria through Turkey, may I add, right? So as we're seeing this a coup that is not a coup, as Patrick said, Russia is still helping out. And there's been a question about what will become of Wagner, because you have Wagner in Africa, in some countries, deployed in a limited fashion in Mali, then in Sudan, then in Central African Republic, and also allegedly a few of them are also in Syria. So now the question is, what becomes of them? But with Syria, it's a different matter, because we're really talking about the Russian armed forces, not just about Wagner. Wagner do not play any a large role in Syria. Just to make that clear, it's really the Russian armed forces. And I think it says a lot that the Russians are being attacked by 50 nations, the majority of them NATO, and still commits resources to Syria. The Russians actually have a base in Syria, a naval base on the Mediterranean, and despite the obvious strategic value of that, it's funny because that base was in tatters. It was falling apart until the Russians came to help, along with Hezbollah and Iran, and now they have upgraded that base in the last years. It's state of the art, and has all types, all types, all sizes and shapes of Russian ships. And the funny thing is, you'll hear people complain about the Iranian presence in Syria, or the growing Russian influence in Syria. I mean, you've no one to blame but yourselves, right? NATO, because if they hadn't gone through with this regime change project in Syria and hadn't destabilized Iraq next door, none of this would have happened, if you're so concerned about Russia being in Syria or Iran being in Syria. Although, again, I would leave that concern up to Syrians and not a bunch of Western think tanks who don't know their bum from their elbow. Russia is still helping with that, but it's the front line. I mean, the lines haven't changed since 2019, you could say, right? So it's a static situation, and it's like that on purpose, because as much as Russia helps militarily, the sanctions are really killing people, and that was engineered on purpose by Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump. That they understood militarily they cannot win, that's a lost cause. But they decided to pursue a scorched earth policy, as I call it. And so they're just starving people out in Syria with these Caesar Act sanctions, which are extremely brutal. But the thing is that the world is changing. I think Anna mentioned earlier the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS. All of these institutions and systems that are now building an alternative world to what we currently have, an alternative system. Syria has made very clear, and this was the Syrian foreign minister. Excuse me, he's the deputy foreign minister and the minister of finance. They were talking about Syria making a formal application to BRICS, or BRICS Plus, as we should call it now, and also to join the SCO. And Belt and Road Initiative, already last year, I think, or rather 2 years ago, Syria applied for that. So all of a sudden, Turkey now want to be friends, right? I would also mention that, given it's a NATO army and the largest NATO, or second largest NATO army, I think, after no, it's the largest. Yeah, it's the largest one. So in any case, the point still stands that Erdogan wants to be friends now with Assad after trying to kill him for 10 years. But I think that's only because he's realized that the pressure, that he's realized it's a lost cause, and also this pressure on him from Iran and from Russia. All right, so I would like to highlight that point, that they're really putting pressure on him to make amends with Syria, because after all, they're neighbors, and they want to have Turkey pull out. Once Turkey pulls out, then that's already a problem halved. But not 1 inch of Syrian land is going to be ceded to Turkey, and I think they need to understand that. They're not going to get away with murder and then on top of it take away land, because after the First World War, and Lawrence had led the Arab revolt. Arabs were stabbed in the back by the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So you had a lot of Syrian land that was handed away to Turkey. A lot of Armenian land, by the way, that was also handed to Turkey. I often ask myself, why do African countries and a lot of Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries still keep these borders? It's a wonder to me. They should go back and redraw their own borders, not keep Western borders. But I think it's a matter of time before they leave, because they cannot sustain this occupation. And when I say they, I mean both the United States and Turkey. It's not in their interests. I think Turkey have understood that they don't want to miss out on BRICS. They don't want to miss out on Belt and Road, and so it's in their best interests to simply pull out of Syria and give back the land.
Richard Medhurst, thank you so very much for participating in this excellent meeting.